Great. So I will introduce our wonderful panelists joining us here this evening. Eric Glover is an assistant professor adjunct of dramaturgy and dramatic criticism at Yale, where he is an expert in Black musical theater. Eric's first book in progress, An Anti-Racist History of the Musicals and the Anti-Musicals of Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, makes a case for taking them seriously as musical theater writers. Eric's writing appears in his articles written for a general audience, JADT, the Sondheim Review, Theater Journal, and Willpower. Eric was elected executive committee member of the American Society for Theater Research by its members and will begin a 3-year term in 2020 in the field of theater and performance studies. Eric has also worked as a production dramaturg for Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun, Yale Repertory Theater. It is important to Eric, an alumnus of the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, that a career in higher education be open to underrepresented minority groups. Eric is proud to be the first Black full-time dramaturgy and dramatic criticism faculty member at Yale School of Drama ever in its history. And he's waving now. Next, Sean Mays is a music director based in New York City with a background, oh dear, I have this formatted incorrectly, with a background in London and the UK. He is an active member of the Broadway community as a music director, conductor, vocal coach, accompanist, orchestrator, arranger, and pit musician. Sean is a proud music director in education circles with Disney Theatrical, New York City Center, and the New York Pops, and is a part-time musical professor of musical theater at Sheridan College in Canada. In 2019, Sean was the music director and conductor of the Canadian premiere of The Color Purple. As an author, Sean has published on the role of Black music directors on Broadway and the retracing of Black practitioners through Black musical history. And our next panelist, Paula Marie Seniors, PhD historian in ethnic studies scholar and associate professor of Africana Studies at Virginia Tech. She is the biographer of May Mallory and the Monroe Defense Committee. Her parents, Audrey Proctor Seniors and Clarence Henry Seniors, founded the Monroe Defense Committee, which bound us together with May and Pat Mallory as family. Her forthcoming book, May Mallory, the Monroe Defense Committee and World Revolutions, African American Women Radical Activists, 1958 to 87, is coming out through University of Georgia Press, explores why working class African American woman, May Mallory, Miss Ethel Azalea Johnson of the Negroes with Guns movement, her mother, Audrey Proctor Seniors, and Mallory's daughter, Pat Mallory, chose radical activism, Maoism, Trotskyism, Cubanism, and self-defense to promote civil and human rights and justice in the U.S. And finally, we have as a moderator for them, Wingspace member Tamilla Woodard, is the co-artistic director of Working Theater. This season, her work includes American Dreams by Lila Buck, Where We Stand by Donetta Lavinia Grays for WP Theater and Baltimore Center Stage, Carol Churchill's Top Girls at American Conservatory Theater, and direction and co-conception of Warriors Don't Cry, a co-production of the Bushnell Center for the Performing Arts and Theater Works USA. Recently named one of 50 women to watch on Broadway, Tamilla is a graduate of Yale School of Drama, where she also teaches. And with that, I will hand you to Tamilla to lead this discussion.
Thank you so much, Edward, and Christine and Luke for just inviting this conversation into this space. I'm very excited to engage these really incredible scholars and makers and doers in a conversation about Black musical theater, which is not something we all hear much about. And I want to give a little bit of time for each one of these really incredible people to say a little bit about who they are and how they come to this subject matter in their own practice and their own scholarship. So I'm going to go backwards and start with, not backwards, but I'm going to go, normally we start with Eric for reasons that will be obvious later, but I'm going to actually start with Sean and ask Sean to self-introduce himself, you know, the who, the how, and the why in your relationship to this topic.
Thank you so much. I was wondering what order we were going to go in, so there we go. We rolled the dice. Well, first I should say, of course, thank you for moderating as well. And thank you all for being here this evening. I think that's a big part of this as well, is the fact that we are here and engaging with this conversation in this space. And certainly I'm very, very honored to be a part of that, and to be able to talk a bit about how I intersect with that as well. So thank you all for that. It's great to be with you. Similarly, I guess, as we heard at the beginning, in terms of my start into this work, I suppose, or where I come at it, I'm based out of New York City. I am Canadian originally, but go back and forth between New York and Toronto, and across the States, across Canada as well, as a music director. And so for years now, working in theater, I some time ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, I was approached to contribute a chapter. I was approached to contribute a chapter to a collection that was being brought together and edited by Sarah Whitfield, who her and I, she's my writing partner, and her and I have collaborated on another project, which I'll get to in a moment, which also touches in this realm. But Sarah approached me and asked as if I would write a chapter, and the whole book, the book Reframing the Musical, which has now made its way into, luckily, more academic circles as far as theater, where theater is concerned, and especially musical theater. As sort of this book to try and reframe, quite literally, the perspective that we as theater goers, theater enjoyers, scholars of theater, makers of theater, and of course teaching students as well, to basically try and say whose narrative are we considering, and the history of those narratives, and how those how do we access those narratives, and what narratives have been lost, as we try and think about, well, what is this form that we know and love and engage with. And so I was approached to initially embrace this as writing a chapter just on the lost history of the music director. And so I was fascinated by this, of course. A big thing for me is being a practitioner. It's very important to me. And that's why I love engaging with scholarship, is because my practice is research, enables just a plethora of material that I can consider and think of when I say, well, who are the people who laid the groundwork for the work that I do, and not just the work that I write about, but who is conducted, who is music directed before me, and has set that path for me to get to where I am. So I was very interested on the broadest scope, and saying, right, let's look at this and see where, the chapter initially as an idea was saying, let's look at the music director, and let's consider the ways in which musical theater, we actually don't talk about the contribution of the music director all that much, which is fascinating, considering that, especially in consideration with other musical forms such as opera, we have these exemplars of that, where the conductor is often heralded as sort of this grand, the helm at the helm of the ship, right? So I was fascinated with that and started into that realm with it, and then with some more exploration, we were having conversations, and one day, this conversation emerged between us, and we got to the point of saying, well, why don't we explore this from the perspective of Black music directors? And I thought for a moment, and I said, yeah, that's a great idea. And what that did was that opened my mind to just how few names I could even recall myself. And so I think that as a very, very open admission to that, what that did was set this journey off, right? In having to go back. And so my first part of that exploration was just going back to shows that I had done, shows I conducted, works that I'd put on, and people whose names were within scores that I had worked with, within the pages that I had in front of me and were actively reproducing. And to go back and discover names of people who I had never even known were Black as well. And so that, as a journey, started to uncover that, and the chapter talks largely about that, not exclusively from the role of Black music directors, but definitely with a large lens to that. And in exploring that, I was so fortunate to be able to do so because, of course, what we find is that the more that we look at, it's one thing, especially when we're talking about this one specific role. For me as a music director, it was considering in scholarship, we know very little, we know very few names, and we think just even on the level of Broadway, if we're using this as one, one angle or one lens, which all of us, I think at some point tonight, will talk about why, when we talk about musical theater, why having that as a lens in and of itself is problematic, and particularly in this context, but we'll arrive at that. But I think that it was interesting to see, just as far as already you have this setup where music directors are talked about so infrequently. And then that gets further and further compounded when you consider music directors who, of color as well as, of course, a number of other identifiers. And so in all of these conversations, I would have conversations with numerous people in our industry who would talk about it, and all of these stories of in present day finding, moments of unfortunately, this repression that has happened, this sort of compression and tossing aside of the narrative of what Black music directors have contributed to the journey of musical theater through time, which is fascinating. And then, of course, when you go back even further, looking at stories of people who are no longer with us, that only magnifies as well. So that was the start of my journey in it. And again, I think for all of us in this space, and for me especially, of course, even admittedly as a practitioner of color in this industry and facing these things in a very, very real fashion, this year, our current situation in COVID is a very, very interesting example of this, because we are now at a point where our industry is attempting to reckon with how do we access, enable, define Blackness within theater, and how do we allow that to be done in a way that is never the same as what has happened before, right? In terms of Black contribution, and not acknowledging the level to which Black contribution is just mammoth, right? And again, which all of us in our own capacities, I'm sure this evening will talk about. And I find it so fascinating as a practitioner to be in the, for lack of a less cliche phrase, in the room where it happens, right? And seeing this and also being able to look at it and having this sort of historical perspective on it and say, what is our journey through that? And for all of us, again, full circle, as people who are engaged with, love theater, are active in making theater happen, how are we mindful of that, and what steps can we take in moving forward?
Tamilla, you're muted.
But you heard me say thank you. I don't know how you did that. Thank you so much, Sean. Thank you. Paula, would you tell us who you are in your relationship to the topic of Black musicals?
Yeah, I actually was a professional dancer. Let's see where to start. Well, this is my book, which is called Beyond Lift Every Voice and Sing: The Culture of Uplift, Identity, and Politics in Musical Theater. And so I was a professional dancer for quite some time, and I became injured, and I did not know what I was going to do. And I had done musical theater shows, not on Broadway, never on Broadway. And so I went to New York. I went to New York University, trying to figure out what I was going to do. And so I was in the MA program and was studying. Did not like the music part of it, but really liked the research. And I was told that I would not find any Black musical theater that was not coon songs, which is akin to the N-word. And I'm from Brooklyn. I was like, that cannot be so. And so then I discovered James Weldon Johnson, J. Rosamond Johnson, and Bob Cole, who wrote these two Black musical theater pieces that made it their way to Broadway, and broke what was called the love scene taboo that said that Black men and Black women could not perform on stage unless comedic or minstrelsque. And so I discovered them. I discovered many other composers as well. But what was interesting about them was Bob Cole, one of the team members, wrote what was called the Declaration of what was it called? The Declaration of Colored Actors' Independence. And he proclaimed that we are going to write our own musicals. We're going to write, direct, produce, count up in the front, and just control it. And so that is what he did in 1898. He had a show that ran for 2 years around the country called A Trip to Coontown. And that's what he did. He was very successful. And then he joined in partnership with Cole and Johnson to produce the 2 Black Broadway musicals that they had. Again, they toured and then they went to Broadway. The first one was called Shoe Fly Regiment, which put Black men and women on stage as the heroic characters of the Spanish-American War, as educated, contesting the representations that had been previously done of Black people. And then their second musical theater piece was called The Red Moon, which was about the Black and Native American education program at Hampton Institute. Again, they broke the stereotype, the love scene taboo stereotype. They moved away from stereotypes of Native Americans and African Americans during that historic time period. So I guess from being a dancer and being injured and then trying to figure out what I was gonna do, that's how I came to do what I do now, which is to write about Black musical theater. I wrote a chapter about Carmen the Hip Opera, which deals with Carmen, the novella, transformed to an African-American concept in Philadelphia, which starred Beyonce. And again, was written, directed, and produced by African-Americans, which I thought was very interesting. And so I was looking at how does that narrative change when it's written, directed, produced, and so on by African-Americans or people, Black people. And so that I thought was very interesting. And so that's how I came to where I am.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you. Eric, will you arrive? Will you please tell us, I mean, this is your field of study, will you please tell us a little bit more about you and how you arrived here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that there were 3 signal moments for me when I was a youth that led me to where I am now. The first is when I was 4 years old, I got the VHS of Wizard of Oz for my birthday. And ever since watching it for the first time, I fell in love with the film. And I also had a coloring book of the film as well that my mother would color with me. And I distinctly remember one day that she colored Dorothy's skin brown like mine. I didn't have the language to describe what it was like to see her do that at the time. But now that I think about it, it was the first time that I really understood the affective and cognitive powers of representational visibility. The next is that because she had an interest in theater and would go to the theater regularly, when I was born, it was just natural for her to take me along. And so the first Broadway show that I saw on Broadway was Cats when I was 7. And that inspired me to be a dancer. And so I danced for 13 years, although I am sure I was not as good as Paula was. My age, but I would also go to see musicals and plays at the Paper Mill Playhouse in Millburn, New Jersey, and also at Theater Fest at Montclair, State University in Montclair. At the same time, my mother had a very large collection of playbills that she collected from her past going to theater, and I would read those playbills that she kept in a drawer in a roll-top desk in my downtime. And so that was where I originally learned about shows like Dreamgirls and Anthony Davis's X, the opera about Malcolm X, also For Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide, / From the Rainbow Is Enough, and also Ma Rainey's Black Bottom also. And then lastly, when I was in high school and applying to colleges, one of the colleges that I was considering going to was Oberlin. And I went to campus there to check it out. And I happened to meet the woman who was in charge of the theater department there. And she's a Black woman, Carolyn Jackson Smith, who is also an alumna of Yale College. But I also had an opportunity to sit in on a rehearsal for the show that she was directing that semester, which was Langston Hughes's song play, Don't You Wanna Be Free? And I remember just being blown away by the rehearsal that I observed. Well, first and foremost, the fact that Langston Hughes was a musical theater writer and a playwright, because at that point in my life, I only knew him through his poetics and his poetry, and that there were so many Black people, Black students in particular, who were involved with the production and the performance of that show. And so I left there disappointed that I had not known about Hughes's drama performance and that none of my teachers had exposed it to me before. And that really led me down a path to learn more about him and more about other Black artists who were involved in musical theater as well. I should also mention that on that same trip, my mother and I met another Black professor there who was a professor of religion, and I am blanking on his name, so forgive me for that. But I remember them having a conversation about the gospel at Colonus as well, and how amazing it was to show at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. And that was also the first time that I had heard about that show. At that point, my mother vowed to purchase a copy of the Catholic Story for me when we got back home. And she did. And so that too also led to my desire to learn more about this area of study and as much as I could as possible.
This is a perfect segue to something we had the benefit of having a very lively conversation about a month ago. That was, and I have to say probably for my behalf because I'm such a novice. And the question came up, and I think this is a really good place for us to start with the definition. What do we mean when we talk about a Black musical? How are each of you defining that? What does it have to be in order for us to define, in order for each of you to say that's a Black musical?
For me, it has to be written, directed, and produced by African American. Although, it can be a show such as, a show that has a large amount of African Americans. But for me, the definitive Black musical theater show or theater show has to be written, directed, and, if possible, produced by African Americans.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned that too, Paula, because I think that, and in posing this question, it kind of points to how, the although there, right, sort of points to how vast that really is, and when we talk about this and we try and think of how do we, for lack of a better word, how do we compartmentalize this idea of what Black musical theater is, right? And I think it's also a worthy question to consider, not just what is Black musical theater, but how does Blackness contend with and intersect with musical theater, right? And again, that history and that lineage is just, you cannot remove the two from, it's always amazing to me, and this has come up before, we in different discussions, and you see things and you're looking through, it's like musical theater, and then you see Black musical theater. Well, it's like, well, Black musical theater is musical theater, right?
Right.
The American theater, the entire American, but especially when we talk about musical theater as a form and its lineage and what it is drawn on in order to create sonically, visually, what is happening on a stage is entirely of the Black canon, right? And so I 100%, an amen to yes, the works that are across the board, right? Not just what we see on stage, but also being produced by and, by Black artists, but also when we step back from that, and that's, in some ways, that's a very tricky thing as well, because we have so many narratives in this art that have been written for Black bodies that have not been written by Black people.
Right.
And so for us, it's also that question of saying, okay, right, how do we define, you know what I mean? And especially when we got, we have so many examples over history, from present day, very present examples on our brain to going back and back and back of this idea of, right, if we see a show that is, written for Black bodies, written for Black production, but is not actually produced, or written, or better yet, even is written by, not Black artists, how does that fit into that narrative as well?
Right.
And I don't have a perfect answer for that as well, but I think it's very interesting.
And I'm inclined to agree with both of them. When I talk about Black musical theater to students, for instance, I am emphasizing musicals by and about Black people. At the same time, to Sean's point, I also recognize that the category of Black musical theater is aesthetically and even politically capacious and does include works by white musical theater writers featuring Black talent. And so not just a Porgy and Bess or a Carmen Jones, but I would also include shows like Cabaret and Chicago, Kiss Me Kate, and West Side Story, which are not musicals that we typically associate with Black musical theater or with Black performers, but that did have Black performers in the opening night casts of their original Broadway productions. And so for me, it is important to center musicals by and about Black people, to emphasize our lineage in this art form, at the same time that I do not want to erase or forget the contributions of Black artists who integrated other musicals as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, that's why I include in my Black theater class, I include shows like The Great Comet and Hadestown and the multiracial production of Oklahoma, and of course my beloved West Side Story. If I was teaching now, I'd include that, my beloved 21st century production, I would include all of those in my classes, which I do, you know.
Let's go back in the Wayback Machine. I mean, Paula, you mentioned 1898, and I know that, you know, we're talking about Peculiar Sam and Shuffle Along and Carmen the Hip Hopper and Moving Through Time and Tina, all the way up to Tina, the musical, Katori Hall's musical. But how are we as a modern, what are we missing as a contemporary audience or contemporary spectator in Black bodies in a theater that wasn't necessarily the experience of Black bodies in the theater when we were looking, when Peculiar Sam or Shuffle Along were available? How is our presence as audience members or as integrated members of a storytelling community different? Is that an unanswerable question? I think I'm going to say, like, what's different, you know, was the work of Black creators received or housed differently at the burgeoning of commercial musical?
You know, it's interesting because when you read the reviews, they're almost the same. You know, so for example, you know, Treemonisha, when it was performed in Atlanta in 1972, and when it was performed as the opera written by Scott Joplin, and when it was performed on Broadway a couple of years later, the reviews in the white press were distinctly racist. And so you had that same type of response to a show like Shoe Fly Regiment, Bob Cole and Johnson's Shoe Fly Regiment, and 1906, 1908, and The Red Moon, 1908, 1910. You still had, you know, resistance to changes in representations of African Americans, you know, and when you read the reviews, they're very similar, you know, which is kind of interesting. I think, you know, back then, you know, because it was in New York, people had access to the shows, you know, Black people had access to the shows, but in terms of the reviews, you saw a distinct difference. The white reviewers were distinctly racist, and then the Black reviewers were very laudatory. And so you see that, you know, even, I mean, I think Treemonisha was like 1977, something like that on Broadway. It was, oh, there's my PowerPoint. It was, there it is. He's got the Treemonisha. Yeah, 1972 in Atlanta. And the reviews were racist, but the Black reviews were very laudatory. So there was a whole spread about this first production of Treemonisha in the Ebony magazine with beautiful, you know, photographs, you know, that I couldn't get because they are, you know, they have them where you can't get them. But I think that would be one of the differences. I think another difference would be the audience members, whereas in that early time period, people were able to go because the tickets weren't punitively high, you know, so that would have been a difference too. You would have seen more, I believe you would have seen more, how do you call it? A more mixed audience than you would see now.
I absolutely agree with that. I think that one major difference that I also noticed between historical musicals by and about Black people and contemporary musicals by and about Black people is that historical musical theater writers actually anticipated Black people dramaturgically. By that I mean, when they sat down to write their musicals, they knew that Black people would be in the audience. And
Yes.
that's a very different experience from what happens when I go to the theater today, where it is readily apparent to me that I am not the target audience for many of the shows that are being produced commercially. And related to that, I think that generally speaking, Black people are discerning cultural consumers. And so I don't think necessarily that our absence in the audience today is solely because of ticket prices. I think it's because, quite frankly, most Black people are not interested in musicals and plays about white people's problems, as I like to say. And certainly musicals that are produced on the Chitlin circuit and elsewhere are very popular, and Tyler Perry charges just as much as Scott Rudin to see his productions. And so I agree with what Paula was saying about the responses in the Black press and in the white press. And I also agree with what she was saying about the audience as well.
Although I would have to say that it was very interesting. We went to see King Kong. And the only reason we went to see King Kong was because the Fay Ray was Black. And surprisingly, the majority of the audience was Black, you know, in King Kong, the musical. Yeah.
I think that's I guess just to piggyback on those ideas, I mean, I think it's a fascinating thing to also, Eric, I mean, you point to it as far as how this history, and perhaps even something that, I mean, certainly something that I've only considered at a glance, but would be very, very interested to look at in more detail, you know, as far as how Black theater goers are very, very able to be very specific in our consumption. Right. And then that is in many ways thinking about how that as a protective measure as well. Right. Engaging with theater and through time, you know, and through so many years, right, is exactly that. You know, why as Black theater goers, you know, are we going to go to a show and sit through a show that is clearly not written? And I mean, even as far as, you know, shows that are trying to be universal, you know, whatever that means, but you know, as far as writing a show that an audience right across the board can come to, you know, I mean, it's so evident in so many things, especially today, you know, you go to and you're just like, this is absolutely not intended for me. And I think it's fascinating to see how, as you know, Eric and Paula, as you've both mentioned too, about how Black, when the authorship and the ownership of musical theater has existed for Black creators, how that has also, how those audiences have also reflected that, but also how, like, I can think of even in some of our, my work and my work with Sarah, who I mentioned before, Sarah Whitfield, my collaborator. I mean, we, you know, and unearthing, I mean, we talk a great deal in the text that we've just set for publication about the Broadway musical In Dahomey, the start of the 20th century, 1903. You know, and you just like, you think of this, okay, 120 years later, here we are. And yet as this exemplar for, you know, as a team of all Black creators who create this show that white audiences are coming to in droves, loving, but that is very, very specifically dealing with Blackness, and is very, in its content too, also dealing with pointing to and giving to the Black theater going community, right? And I think that in scholarship and in, you know, as we talk about white spectatorship, there is this notion that Black artists as well are complacent and have created theater for, you know, that black creators have been, you know, have existed, for lack of a more refined term, to create theater that white audiences can consume, right? And I think that it's fascinating when you actually go back and you look through the content of these shows, when you look at how they were created, how they were marketed, you know, all of these things, is that all along the way, even though that there has been an attempt to try and rob Black writing and Black, you know, creation of its ownership of that work, that ownership has always been there. Mm-hmm. Right, which is a very powerful thing. And to see that, even looking at some of these pieces from years ago, that you know, again, even with through as many topics as they may cover, you know, it's so fascinating to go back and say, well, what were these creatives actually doing, right? And when we read current scholarship, you know, there's a notion to kind of say, well, you know, it's all viewed through a white lens. And so when you do that, it's very easy to pass these things off as either, one, just not important to the narrative of theater, but two, that Black writers weren't also, and producers weren't also thinking about the exact same things that white writers and white producers think about too, right? And in many ways, we're able to do so in a very successful way because they're able to create content that, even though it was being, that white audiences may have just thought it was there to entertain them, this is actually stuff that they were engaging with and being able to actually be very, very successful with as well, which is fascinating.
And some of what was done was subversive, you know, so Absolutely. You know, the white audiences are thinking they're going to see, you know, a musical, you know, about a Black people, but they're seeing Black soldiers on stage, for example, in Shoe Fly Regiment, with weapons, which is hearkening to their minds, you know, the Ethiopians fighting against the Italians, the Haitian Revolution. And so this leads into why the shows are not getting good reviews. But I think it's very important when you look at these shows to look at the Black reviews. So the New York Age, the Indianapolis Freeman, and so on, and see how they responded to it. And even, wasn't Ada Overton Walker in Dahomey?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, she wrote about theater. You know, she wrote about her experience and about what she could and could not do, what they could and could not do as Black as creative Black people in the Williams and Walker troupe. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so true. And absolutely that, Paul, is so subversive and it is just this reframing of that, right? Like if we think about that and say, well, of course, like let's actually just for 1 minute think about what these Black creatives were doing, right? And that the fact that scholarship and that the viewpoint of theater tries to situate it in a spot where the only thing that Black writers could do was write stereotypical shows about themselves that weren't trying to, you know, I mean, it attempts to put all of these amazing thinkers in this very two-dimensional narrative. And it's just absurd. You know, it doesn't take much thought or consideration to just step back from the picture for a second and say, wait a minute, like, why would they also have been doing that, right?
Right.
Surely there must have been more at play here if we just consider it for, you know, even a couple of seconds more, right? It's really interesting.
And I think that Sean's point really speaks to the importance of scholars of Black expressive culture writing about musical theater, writing about Black people. Because oftentimes the scholarship that gets written about Black musical theater is not written by people who are students of race.
Right.
I want to second Paula's point about the Black press and the importance of reading historical reviews of productions that were written by Black critics who were praising these works. One of my favorite critics is Nora Holt, who was very active in reviewing music and theater in the middle of the 20th century. And I also wanted to remind us that one of the primary avenues by which Black performers enter the entertainment industry was through Blackface minstrelsy.
Mm-hmm.
Dovetails with Paula's point about early Black musical theater writers having to walk a fine line between telling the stories that they wanted to tell about Black people, but doing it subversively.
Right.
To protect themselves from anti-Black racism and white supremacy.
Yes.
I'm interested. This occurs to me thinking about why is it, or how is it, or maybe it's not, that white spectators are viewing Black music differently than they're viewing Black musicals. If what Sean is saying is, always like the critical lens is so muddied by the perspective of the white critic and white supremacy, is that also reflected in Black? It seems to not be as reflected in Black music as it is in Black musicals, if for no other reason that there is far less, there are fewer Black musicals than there is, and Black musical makers who are known and celebrated culturally than there are Black musicians.
I would say that Black music is the response to Black music is very similar to the response of Black musicals. So, for example, the song, and I'm going back, all coons look alike to me, right? The white audiences love that song. The song became very popular. The man who wrote it said that I wished I had never written the song because the word coon did not become popular and readily used until I wrote that song. And then I think even looking at some of the classical composers, I mean, it's for like William Grant Still and others, they were not fully accepted either, right? As fully classical musicians, right? Scott Joplin's Treemonisha, I mean, the reviews about that were quite critical of that music. So I don't see that Black music is looked at differently, because I would say that's why you're all too young to remember, but there used to be Black radio stations and there used to be white radio stations. And to listen to Black music was how you call it, taboo for some white audiences. And so they looked at it as, thinking about rock and roll, they looked at it as dirty music, right? So I wouldn't say that I think it's all connected.
I'm inclined to agree with that. I would also say that even today, Black people do not get to benefit materially from the culture that we create. Whenever I teach, I always get in trouble when I share this example with my students. But I always say that a singer like Adele is fascinating to me because I can walk into any Black church on Sunday and find a woman who can sing infinitely better than she does, and yet Adele is the one with a recording contract and not the women in Black churches on Sunday. Similarly, we can think about this through the examples of someone like Rihanna as compared to Lady Gaga. Rihanna is the one who has at least 18 number ones on the Billboard charts. Lady Gaga has how many? Not 18. And yet we think about Lady Gaga as being a pop princess and not Rihanna, who is actually the blueprint. And so I still think that artists today, face obstacles, racism and sexism that hinder their success and their broad universal appeal as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that also, you know, to further to Eric and Paula, both of your points as well, you know, pointing it back to theater, we see so many instances. I mean, where we think of how Black culture is borrowed, well, not even borrowed, is
Stolen.
Stolen, yeah, is stolen, and you know, and again, you know, it's like this has been, how many times have we heard, you know, they say they want the culture but not the people, right? People steal, you know, everything from the culture, but don't, you know, it stops when it actually just involves having us, right? I mean, it's and we see it in everything. We see it in the music we listen to that's produced, right? We see it in, I mean, it just like right across the board. I mean, that is the reality of our world. And then you tie that back into theater, which is directly reflective of that experience. And it's the same thing, right? I mean, it's like, yeah, George Gershwin was going down the road, going to, you know, the Black shows and coming out of them, and then sitting down to think of writing stuff for, you know, Rhapsody in Blue or what have you, right? I mean, right across Porgy and Bess, like, you know, these idioms, these ideas, you know, again, pointing back to that as far as Black culture, as far back as it goes, like, you know, and then on the opposite end of that, you know, you look at stuff, you know, and you compare truly Black shows of the same time, and then you look at things authored like Porgy and Bess or what have you, and it's like, well, you know, there's this rush to just magnify and praise these works by, you know, white composers, you know, white creators that have, you know, it's just culturally been stolen forever.
Right.
And is heralded as being this, instead of being stolen, as like, oh, look at what this person has extrapolated from this other culture and taken in and refined and made, you know, and I mean, and so when we talk about all of these things on a societal level of why is there such imbalance? I mean, it breaks down to literally even that, right? White authors and composers in theater who have been able to pay mortgages on homes over other, you know, other, and literally, and it comes down to that basic, and you go back and you read these stories of all of these incredible Black authors and creators who you're like, how in the world, you know, the success of their shows, which was just like multitudes higher, sometimes in some cases than like a lot of white shows, and you're like, what happened?
Yeah.
Like, there we go, right? It's fascinating, and our theater again is just the reflection of that, you know.
Yeah.
That's it.
Well, I thought the best couple of scenes in Shuffle Along, I think it was 2016, was the tap dance where he talked about the fact that George Gershwin stole I Got Rhythm. And also, well, people don't mention this, but you know, Fats Waller wrote Summertime, and Porgy and Bess, J. Rosamond Johnson, Eva Jesse were the musical directors and the choirs that were used. So the sound that we're hearing from Porgy and Bess, as you've just said, are distinctly African-American. The same thing, well, not African-American, but the same thing with The Lion King. You know, Lebo M's name is real tiny on there, you know, for The Lion King, but all of that South African style music that we are listening to, that person wrote it, that South African wrote it, and their name is this small. Their name is this small on the thing. And then, you know, let's not even forget, you know, what's it called? In the Jungle, the Lion Sleeps Tonight, written by a South African who died impoverished, you know, and so, you know, you have this theft of Black creative forms, you know, that's amazing. And even thinking about places like the Cotton Club, where, you know, they didn't hire, you know, Black composers. They hired, you know, Vincent Minnelli and people like that to put on those shows, whereas Fats Waller and James P. Johnson and those were performing at Small's Paradise and Andy Razoff were writing musicals for those shows, you know. But what do we hear about? We hear about the Cotton Club, but it was not controlled by Black people, whereas Small's Paradise was, you know.
I also think it's important to think about the labor that actors and actresses perform toward originating their roles.
Yes.
I think of Todd Duncan and also Ann Wiggins Brown as being creators to borrow
Yes.
Bruce Curl in the creation of Porgy and Bess. I also wanted to mention that at the same time that George Gershwin was beginning work on Porgy and Bess, Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston were also beginning work on a folk opera. All of this is happening in 1926. Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston actually the Theater Guild with their idea for a Black folk opera, but they were actually rejected, and they were told that their idea was too grimly earnest. And yet, as we know, the Theater Guild ultimately produced the original Broadway production of Porgy and Bess. Of barriers that Black artists historically faced when it came to getting their work produced, which is also a barrier that artists today
still face. What is it? Can you talk a little bit about, we mentioned a little bit of the Chitlin Circuit, but I'm curious about spaces that are not commercial Broadway spaces and how, you know, the Black musical and work that is housed inside of Black bodies and Black creatives, like where's that in the sort of lineage and the chronology?
Well, as I mentioned, the nightclubs in Harlem, where James P. Johnson, this is in the 1920s, James P. Johnson, Fats Waller, Andy Razoff, they would write shows for places like Small's Paradise. And so they would write, and this is a time period when you're having reviews instead of book shows, right? And so they would write, and they were quite prolific in writing shows for those places such as that in Harlem, yeah. And then you have places, you know, currently like the Billie Holiday Theater in I don't know if they're still in existence, but in Brooklyn, New York, I mean, the first show I did was called Blues for a Gospel Queen at the Billie Holiday Theater, you know, and so you have places such as that, Karamu Theater in Ohio, you know, places. There used to be a place, I don't know if it's still in existence, Crossroads, which used to produce, you know, Black shows, right? I'm not sure, but during that early time period, it was those nightclubs in Harlem and elsewhere that had the composers that produced shows. So the one that they did at Small's Paradise, they had a song called A Porter's Love Song to a Chambermaid, which was humanizing, you know, these working class people, right? And then they had another song that was a homage, because at that time period, a lot of Black people were communist. And so they had a song that was in homage to Black communism, James P. Johnson, Andy Razoff, and those people. Yeah.
And the Chitlin Circuit is important to me because I consider the artists who work there to be Langston Hughes's heirs. Langston Hughes's influence on Broadway. Not only do we think about his collaboration with other Black artists like Zora Neale Hurston or white artists like Kurt Weill, but we also look to him as being the originator of the gospel sound on Broadway with Joe Plumlee through Tambourines to Glory. And anecdotally, Robert Guillaume was in the original Broadway cast of that show, as was Mickey Grant. But Tyler Perry and Debbie D. Talbert, who now people associate with film and television, really got their start writing gospel plays and gospel musicals, for Black audiences around the country. And so when I teach courses in Black theater history and in musical theater history, it is important for me to share those voices as well, to get students to realize that the American theater is not just Broadway, off-Broadway, and the regional theater, but that it is also the Chitlin Circuit, community theater, and productions of musicals and African-American houses of worship as well.
Yeah, it was certainly my experience of musicals and Black musicals was what is referred to as the Chitlin Circuit in Houston, Texas. I mean, were spaces of welcome, where the institutional, the theaters, that were not the ensemble theater, that was the alley, didn't feel welcoming. They didn't feel that they were places that I could sit comfortably and feel like I belonged. I want to open this room up to a conversation with the audience, also to questions from the audience. I'll seed one, which is, how do we get early Black musicals on the radar for production? For any artistic directors watching. Where is it? Where's the archive?
Well, the Colin Johnson archives are at Yale. The majority of them are at Yale University, and I've actually put together obviously not published, but the book of the musicals, the music that were in those shows. The books are lost.
Okay.
And what I appreciate about this question is that today there seems to be this perception that non-traditional casting is the solution to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the American theater. And what frustrates me about the conversation, as I hear it happening currently, is that there is this suggestion that historical plays and musicals by and about Black people do not exist. And so, to Paula's point, this material is in the archive, yes, but many of these scripts and books and scores have also been published as well. And so for me, if I'm being honest, I think that people are not interested in producing this work because they think that it is inherently inferior than the work of white musical theater writers and playwrights. And so what I think we need to do is really unlearn everything that we culturally about what counts as art, who counts as an artist, and what types of work are valuable.
Yeah, right, because we're constantly reviving West Side Story and Cabaret. Damn Yankees. Oklahoma.
Oklahoma. And honestly, the music of Colin Johnson is quite beautiful. I mean, I have people sing it, and I play it in my classes, and some of the music is quite beautiful. It's quite beautiful. Yeah.
questions, and if you can either send them in the chat or open your video and ask them, so that we're actually in a conversation with these remarkable artists. Something else from the chat also is that this will be assigned viewing for New School and some Rutgers students. And what do you panelists have to say to young performers in particular? There was a real dust up at Pace, particularly in the musical theater department, right? And the sort of, and how like the training of Black and brown bodies has been so violent and so dismissive.
I would say that was my experience at NYU. That was my experience at NYU. City College in New York was wonderful, you know, but all my teachers were Black. You know, I mean, as a dance major. That's a shame about Pace, because a lot of the shows I've seen recently, I've seen a lot of Black talent from Pace. So that's sad.
And there are two things that I would say. One, everything that I know about Black theater history, I taught. And when I was a college student, I learned very quickly that I had to be the commander of my educational experience. And so I say that to say this. I definitely encourage the students to continue to work with their instructors, but I also want them to think critically about the courses that they are taking, to think critically about what is being assigned on their syllabi, and to remember that there is nothing stopping them from doing more work on their own than what their instructor requires. And I would also offer up one of my favorite quotes from The Color Purple, the musical. You're beautiful. Yes, you're beautiful. And you're here.
Yeah, I think it's important for, you know, we've been having these conversations in some of my classes as well. And, you know, I think the consideration, everybody, you know, so much has happened in the last 6-7 months, right? That reflects in terms of the world and where we're at and how we want to move forward. And we've had a lot of time for, you know, in a very different realm to pause and to consider this as well. And I know it's something that a lot of my students even are very cognizant of. They're like, what do we do? How do we move forward from here, right? And I think for our students, we also have to consider, how are they entering into an industry and an art that we are trying to, you know, basically turn upside down, right? To change the entire way that we look at this, the entire way that it is structured. And so, particularly for students who do not identify as students of color, right? The immense amount of work that they have to do and have to learn how to do, right? We talk about so much as far as all of this talk, you know, now everybody wants to talk about the importance of, you know, dismantling white supremacy and talking about structural and systemic racism, right? And as an art, you know, for our students, they're the ones now who really at this moment have to contend with and reckon with the fact that an industry that they are going into is going to have very, very different thoughts, hopefully, that even from the time when they started their journey as a performer in school, right? So, you know, they have to come out of this and have the, you know, for us as you know, working with students, we have to give them those tools and that knowledge to be able to do that and to be able to look internally. And also, again, just as Erica said, to do that work, and to also understand how much of that work before that students who have looked like them and been like them have not had to do, and how their peers of color have had the brunt of that work for so long, right? I mean, that's a pretty heavy thing when we all consider our own educational journey, and you consider what you were taught and who you were taught it by and who was in what you were taught. Right? And how that reflects you are. And that's a massively powerful thing, because that just, of course, as we all know, it reflects how you view the world and how you come into the world. And as a result, the changes that you make upon the world. Right. And so, you know, that sounds like this grand, lofty idea, but it really is that if we impress that upon students now, you know, especially students who are not students of color, to do the work, right? Go out and do the work and try to understand just for a moment, right? How that glimpse into that, I think that's going to be one of the only chances we stand at really, really from the ground up changing how we look at this, because then they can come into this industry and know how to, when it is appropriate to center themselves and when it is appropriate to decenter themselves, and why it's important to do that as well.
And Sean's comment also makes me think of the example of Katori Hall, who started out as an actress originally, but because she was so unhappy with the material that she was given, she was inspired to become a playwright and a theater writer. So now she has Tina on Broadway, and then also the television show P-Valley. And so to emphasize what Sean and Paula were saying, students also have to be willing to change that they want to see in the world, for lack of a better phrase, instead of waiting for someone else to make that change happen on their behalf.
And challenge the idea of the first, because there's so much lineage is just buried and out of sight. Antoinette, you have your hand up.
Half a day, Todos Hansu. I just said hello in Chamorro, and especially to my good friend Paula Seniors, who I admire so deeply. I had a long day, and someone sent me this invitation. It's like, gosh, that sounds like fun. And it has been. So, but I actually do have a question. I am a sociologist, and I'm a first generation, perhaps like some of you, Indigenous Pacific Islander, first generation scholar, activist. Had a very rough go. So like the way I basically summarize it is, I am yet another woman of color who was disappeared from Oberlin College. But with that, along the journey before all of that happens, my other comment is that my motto is that I have never been willing to cooperate with my own disappearance. So I keep popping up in places. But given this topic, which is, I'm so excited to ask about this. Years ago, when I think about musical theater as a Pacific Islander, South Pacific comes up, right? And I specifically, I don't know if we overlapped at UCSD at this time, Paula, but there was an anthropologist who, and they wrote about it in the paper, who brought these doctoral students to, I'm not sure which Pacific Island, over the summer, and it was written up, and I wrote a letter to the editor, and I said, my question is, are you bringing any Pacific Islanders over here, right? And I quoted Bloody Mary, who I have just recently, the ancestors are intervening. This is my COVID hairdo. And I've been saying I don't know if you can see it. I've been saying it's a cross between Bloody Mary from South Pacific and I Dream of Jeannie as a baby boomer. So a couple of things. One, any comments? I was fascinated by the way you talked about Black musicals and how you would include West Side Story and other musicals that surprised me, but I get where you were going with that. So I was wondering where you'd put South Pacific into that conversation. And then the other comment would be that I do have my brother's daughter is a BFA in theater at University of Michigan. She is a Filipina. She's Pinay Chamorro. And I looked at one of her scholarship application that talked about Mulan and how important Mulan was to her, and especially with the emergence, you know, the release of that. So I'm all over the place, but I guess also, you know, I wish I would have been able to, if this is recorded, I'm going to make sure she watches it. But so I'm going all over the place. But so where does South Pacific fit for me? I ended up writing a letter to the editor and got chewed out by a white sociologist about how you don't know how much this anthropologist has done for people of color, right? This is in the 90s. You know, absolutely nothing. And this is supposedly a critical sociologist. And, but I remember the quote I put in when I ended my letter to the editor, rather. It's like, you know what? We are not just pretty people, no. I want to be remembered for more than that. And I find Bloody Mary as a character really interesting. And then there's linkages between, again, the Blackness or how Pacific Islanders are perceived. And then there's a contemporary piece of how Pacific Islander bodies, like Black male athlete bodies, are used in professional sports and college sports. Without necessarily being sure that they matriculate with 4-year degrees. So I'm asking you a lot, but my goodness, I was supposed to be done with teaching, and you guys you drew me back in. So it was Paula's fault. And Lisa Bratton, so anyhow, so I'll be quiet. I can't wait to hear.
Well, I was just going to say quickly that I think that it absolutely fits, especially again, because there were Black performers in the opening night of the original Broadway production, most notably Juanita Hall, who played Bloody Mary, and who was also in Flower Drum Song as well. And certainly Black actresses have an interesting history playing the role. You know, one of the I can think of is Lillias White, who is a Black actress, and a phenomenal singer who played the role in a concert version alongside Reba McEntire and Brian Stokes Mitchell. But to answer your question, I think that it absolutely fits. I also think that it speaks to the persistence of yellowface in American musical theater, and especially how Black performers were complicit in that practice. And so yellowface occurs in South Pacific, it occurs in Dahomey from 1903. It even occurs in Tyler Perry's musical I Can Do Bad All By Myself from 1999. And I think what's dangerous about that is it perpetuates this narrative that there are no Asian or Asian American musical theater performers who can play those roles. And the only other thing I would say is that I love Lea Salonga, and I have loved her Aladdin, Disney's Aladdin. And so I would hope that this young person that you know familiarizes herself with Lea's work, if she hasn't already, if only to see that a blueprint has already been established for her that she can follow as a student and when she ultimately graduates as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I was going to mention Juanita Hall in South Pacific as well. And I was also going to mention the fact that when the Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote both South Pacific and Flower Drum Song, at one point they were looking to put Diane Carroll into one of those roles. And, you know, she could not pass for, you know, Asian. So they wrote a show for her called No Strings instead. What I found interesting when I was at UCSD was that they did try to revise Flower Drum Song with David Wong. I believe he wrote the book for it, and it was not successful because it was not very good. And then with the Yellowface, as Eric points out, you know, in Flower Drum Song, the only people who could play the romantic leads were white men. Actually, one of them is actually Kazakh, but he had, Larry Storch was actually from Kazakhstan, and he actually had eye surgery to make him look white. So he actually was Asian, passing for white. But Larry Blyden and Larry Storch were the romantic leads in Flower Drum Song, because you could not, like the prohibition with black men and black women having a romantic relationship, you could not have that with Asians unless the man was white. You know, so it's a very complicated, weird thing that happened with that in musical theater. And then the last one that I recall was Thoroughly Modern Millie, which was really offensive, in which the Asian characters were not allowed to speak English, but they had the subtitles. They're not called subtitles. They had the words. They were speaking, I forgot what Chinese dialect they were speaking, but they were speaking in a Chinese dialect, and then they had the English words crawling at the top of the stage. So that was quite problematic as well. I think one of the nice things that we have now in theater, to me, is, and I only go to Broadway shows, or I only go to shows if people of color are in it. I'm not, like Eric pointed out, I am not interested in seeing all white shows. And so we went to see The Great Comet, in which the two actors, the three lead actors were African American or of Black descent. And the initial character, Deneen, I can't remember her name. But anyway, the initial person was the woman who played Eliza in Hamilton, an Asian woman. And then in Hadestown, which we just happened upon the week before they opened, they have a beautiful multiracial cast of Asians and Blacks, and, you know, just a beautiful array of people, and just a fantastic, both of those shows were very, very interesting to me. But I don't go see shows. I just don't go see shows if Black people or people of color are not in it.
No, that's it. Just one real quick response. Just I want to make very clear that I appreciate the references to Yellowface, but for Indigenous Pacific Islanders, especially those, I'm Chamorro from Guahan, Hawaii, the Kanaka Maoli, the Samoan people. One of the issues that we continue to struggle with is being subsumed underneath the Asian Pacific Islander. So the conditions are different. We are colonized beings, right? American nationals, quote unquote, putative American citizens, but cannot vote in the presidential election. So similar to DC, Puerto Rico, etc. So the histories are different and distinctive. We are very much colonized subjects. So I just would follow on with that. But I do know that my niece has been following Leah Salonga and Professor Glover. I'll make sure she looks you up in the future, because I have a feeling she's going to be pursuing MFA or something at some point. But I really appreciated this conversation. I'm supposed to be done with my week, but I got dragged back into because it was so good. Thank you very much for the responses.
There's a question right here in the chat I just want to bring up from Cindy Tsai. Is there a time in which these shows are too dated or too far gone to revive or produce? And at which point do we retire the shows? Or are all of these shows who feature POCs or are written by POCs still fair game for 2020 and beyond? I know you have an opinion.
Yeah.
Here's a question. What is it that you like, to throw the gauntlet down? What's from each of you? What's a show that we should have on this stage now? That is not a show that was made in the 20th, even in the 21st century. This 20 years that we've been in, or the first half of the second half of the 20th century. What should be on the stage now?
I'm sorry, I wanted to follow up on Paula's last point first, and that I believe the actress you were talking about is Danae Benton, who created
Yes.
Natasha, and then who is currently playing Eliza in Hamilton, and hopefully someday she will play Christine in The Phantom of the Opera. To the question that was just posed in the chat, my instinct is to say that there is no point at which we can ever retire musicals by and about Black people, especially since, as it was mentioned before, it feels like every year we get revivals of West Side Story and The Music Man and every musical that white people have ever written that is known to mankind. And so I think that's my initial response. But one show that I would like to see on Broadway is Zora Neale Hurston's Polk County, which in 1944 would have been the first full-length musical by a Black woman on Broadway, but did not get there because of anti-Black racism and white supremacy.
Yeah, I agree with Eric. The show should not be retired. They should be revised. I would want to see all Shoe Fly Regiment and the Red Moon on Broadway or on the stage anywhere. I'd like to see those shows. I'd like to see Treemonisha on the stage anywhere. I'd like to see any of the musicals that Fats Waller and James P. Johnson have written. Their music is incredible. And Andy Razoff, the lyricist, I'd like to see any of those. But I would want to see Shoe Fly Regiment and the Red Moon on Broadway, as well as those that I just mentioned. But you can't retire something that people won't let come forward. And one thing that I found interesting when I was at NYU is a lot of the music that African Americans have written are owned by large corporations. You have to get permission to use them. And so that leads me to believe that a lot of that music has been appropriated by white composers. Warner Brothers, MCA, and all of these large businesses own a lot of this music. And I found that when I was doing research as a graduate student at NYU, is that some of them you can't use, because they hold it.
Yeah, I think it's.
Thank you for this. This is the Paula's collection, what we're looking at right now. Thank you for assembling this and sharing with us.
Yeah, I just thought they were beautiful. Especially the new images I have of Treemonisha are really exciting.
Sean, what are you putting forward for Bring It Back? Bring It Back now.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's interesting because I think it's I always think about that, and I think about that in the context of being in the theater now. And so this, to not cop out of this answer at all, but I think that, it's kind of, Paula, you alluded to this, I think, as far as who owns the rights and the basis to some of this stuff, right? And so when we start thinking about that as well, and certainly not to disqualify lots and lots of works, many works that could be done, but I think that I think that this points to our present day, and even in looking forward, is that we have to consider as well that, you know, in trying to honor a legacy of the people who have done this work too, is that if we are to truly do that and to be able to revive work and do that in a proper way, is that all of those, you know, that has to point in the correct direction, right? And especially that any sort of revival, anything that happens in a contemporary moment also has immense implications upon, you know, who is benefiting from it right now as well, right? And so these are the larger questions too. I mean, we talk about this all the time. It's like, well, who are our producers?
Mm-hmm.
Who own the rights to these shows?
Mm-hmm.
Who is getting paid to create them? I mean, thank goodness we're seeing more instances where these stories and these types of stories are being done, and creative teams are you know, that don't, and frankly, like for a long period of time now, maybe should not be doing them. They're stepping aside a bit more and saying, yeah, okay, let's, you know, to create way, as much as I hate that, right? And to create space, but I mean, that is truly what it is in many regards. And I think it's also pointing to, you know, again, and who owns the theaters, right? You know, I mean, and these are, it's massive, but it really is, it's the only way, because if not, then it will always be Black artists fighting for ownership, right? And it's not ownership at this level, it's ownership at this level and this level. You know, like what guarantee does a Black author today have of being able to, you know, these are the questions we need to ask, have of being able to have their work produced in a way where they can, you know, maintain control of it in the right way, in a proper way, where the people who partake in it also have that ownership over their creative work, and can do so in a way that creates legacy, you know, as well. Like we talk about all of this as far as there's a reason we haven't known all of these works. And we think about, I mean, you think about estates. I mean, compare like estates of, you think about the amount of money that like an estate like Rodgers and Hammerstein bring in, right? And you can't even compare that in terms of some of this other stuff. So, you know, I think that, I mean, absolutely, you know, let's look at as far as what can be done. I mean, 100% stuff that is appropriate to do. I think that is appropriate to do, you know, from our past. Absolutely. Let's take a look at it. But, you know, we need to also point to the larger picture of, wow, okay, there's that. And then, you know, we also have to have a future as well, right? We have to be looking forward and be considering what are all of the, you know, even the shows that we have now. And, you know, I mean, certainly even as a practitioner working, you know, it's the same thing again. I often think about that. I sit in a room and I think, right, okay, here's my ownership of the work, and how many rungs up the ladder can I go until that ownership dissolves out of Black ownership, right? And that's a scary thing, right? To think of that at some point, as you start to climb higher up, it gets lost again. And then it's like, okay, then we got to hit pause and say, what are we doing? What's going on? Right? So yeah, not to cop out of that, we're not giving a very specific show, because I mean, frankly, there's a number, but yeah, that's especially for me in it, you know, in the trenches like that. I think about that all the time, you know.
And you're right in terms of, you know, ownership and who owns it. So for example, the thing that happened with Treemanisha was that this white woman, Vera Brodsky Lawrence, compelled the Joplin family to give her the trust. And so those people who had been involved with the production in 1972, T.J. Anderson, who orchestrated it, she made it so that he could not publish his orchestrations until 1990, you know. And so you're absolutely right. And and we would not even know about Treemanisha if T.J. Anderson, Wendy Whalum, who was the musical director, Robert, I can't remember his name at the moment, but Catherine Dunham, African-American Catherine Dunham, if they had not done it in 1972, nobody would know about Treemonisha, but he was blocked. His orchestrations were blocked up until the 90s. 1998 is when he published his orchestrations, and he wrote them in 1972. And he was allowed to, that orchestration of Treemonisha was allowed to be done because the woman had died.
Amazing.
I'm gonna hop in here real quick. This conversation is amazing, but having done 16 of these salons, we've decided that we do need to give an escape hatch to our panelists to be respectful of their time. Speaking of which, we do offer honorariums to our panelists. So if you would like to help Wingspace bring more of these conversations, please feel free to send a Venmo to Burke Brown, which I'm putting in the chat. Also, Wingspace is having a membership drive this fall, which you can find information about also as well in the chat. And if you have, if there's a conversation that you would like to hear centering on design, directing, or dramaturgy, please feel free to reach out to us at the email that I've put in the chat. I want to give a big shout out to the Salons Committee, which is Christine Mock, myself, Edward Morris, Kate Freer, Adrian Jones, Luke Cantrella, Elizabeth Mack, and Lee Savage. I want to also announce that our next salon will be on October 22nd, which will be the hosts of the Token Theater Friends podcast, Deep Tran and Jose Solis. So please stay tuned for that. You can find out about it on our Facebook page or on wingspace.com. And yeah, I just want to just give a huge thank you to Eric Glover, Paula Seniors, Sean Mays, and Tamilla for being here with us. I'm going to then turn it back to Tamilla if we want to continue the conversation until 9 or even a little bit after that. But I just want to give a chance for our panelists to leave if they want. Zoom fatigue is real. So thank you all for being here. And yeah, I'm going to go back to the meeting.
Could we take one more question, maybe? I wanted to ask my friend and colleague, Donatella, got a question by any chance? I see that she turned on her camera, which is why I just...
Oh, there you are, Donatella.
I'm trying to unmute.
This is probably happening all at the same time.
Oh, there you are.
So much for unmuting me and for the shout out, Dr. Glover. I just wanted to, I guess, put my video on to be more like in community with all of you. I so appreciated this conversation in showcasing this scholarship and also Black excellence among the scholars themselves. And I'm grateful to, you know, Wingspace for organizing this event. And I also appreciated Sean's comment on, you know, just understanding white supremacy as structural. So it's hard to be like, oh, this one or other show should be retired, I guess. Because we're, you know, embedded in these unequal racial dynamics. But we can also have shows that are anti-racist and shows that help liberate us from white supremacy, even as they also might reiterate these social dynamics. And also I'll add, I appreciated this conversation about triangulating Blackness with whiteness and Asianness, and because there's a long history of Blackface and Yellowface together, and both Asian Americans being these model minority wedges against African Americans, as well as a history of shows with African Americans doing Yellowface as a way to assert oneself in a racial hierarchy in which Asian Americans are pushed away as not really Americans, as perpetual foreigners. So I just really appreciate the richness of this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Donatella.
There was a question that I missed earlier that was about asking about, speaking about the dynamics of Black performance using Blackface in early 20th century musicals. And We sort of missed it in the chat, but if there is a response to that, that might
What
be.
What was the question?
Could the scholars talk more about the dynamics of Black performance using blackface in the early 20th century musicals that you were all discussing previously?
When I was doing my research, I was trying to move away from stereotypes and such. I don't understand the question. Are they asking is about the use of blackface minstrelsy? What are they asking?
The dynamics of Black performance in reference to blackface.
Okay.
That's a question in the chat, and there's one more question in the chat. Is this is a collective of designers, dramaturgs, and directors. Wingspace is, and what's the sort of legacy of American design and designers in reference to the Black musical?
Mm.
Well, these are two great questions. So the first question, as I mentioned before, blackface minstrelsy was the primary avenue by which Black people who were interested in entering the entertainment industry did just that. And what's interesting is that in many of the early Black musicals, there are Black performers who are in blackface performing alongside Black people who are not.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to give the impression that in all of these early musicals, every Black performer was in blackface. That's not the case. And I should also be careful not to ally blackface, the actual makeup, with the practice of the minstrel show, because also we can see elements of the minstrel show embedded in the dramaturgy of early Black musicals as well. And so I'm thinking of a show like Peculiar Sam, where there is the tambourine and the bones used by the actors who are playing characters. There are also jokes about Black people's supposed superstitiousness and fear of ghosts and the haunted that recur in that musical as well. But I would argue that that is not done to reiterate those stereotypes or give life to them, so as Hopkins is using them as a cover to really tell a story about an enslaved Black family going on a journey on the Underground Railroad. And I think it's also important to think about Black artists who are working behind the scenes. I know that for me, I tend to think about performers because that is what I see immediately when I go to the theater. But one person who has been important for me is someone like Jeffrey Holder, who was instrumental in shepherding the original Broadway production of The Wiz, and who was also a designer as well, and who, as I told my friend Anne recently, actually gave Maury Yeston the idea to do a musical adaptation of the novel, The Phantom of the Opera. Fortunately, most people know Andrew Lloyd Webber's version, but Yeston's version is equally delicious. But I just say that to say that Holder is an example of someone who did everything, who performed, who directed, who designed, was really inspiration to Black artists in the past and to today as well.
Spectacular. And I so appreciate that sort of like difference that you're making between minstrelsy and blackface, and also reminding us of the subversion of storytelling and the many layers the many layers of story that exist depending on the POV of the spectator, what can be received.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great. Thank you, everyone. There's 6 more minutes before dinner time happens for everybody else. Are there any other? We invite you to turn on your video, says Edward, if you'd like. Yeah, before we go, if you're in a space where you'd like to share your face or your environment as a way to say, to acknowledge each other's presence here, since we cannot feel each other's the heat of each other's bodies, we can see each other's faces. It would be a wonderful time to greet these panelists. If you're able to do that, no worries if you're not. We'll feel your love with your hand. Your hands. Awesome. So appreciate you being here, and the singularness of your knowledge and your experience is really profound, and I'm really grateful to you. I'm just really grateful to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Question, if we still have time. Paula, where you made this great presentation that we didn't really get to.
Okay.
I tried to bring it up when you were referencing it, but is that part of a lecture that you, as part of one of your courses, or is there any way to make some of that like available to people? I'm just curious, or not, if that's like a.
Well, the materials on the Treemonisha I have not published yet. The Colin Johnson materials are in my book, and then I do teach that as well. Yeah, I mean, I put that together today.
People need to get in touch with you to get you to do a guest lecture at their university, which is a good thing.
Yeah. And but the Treemonisha one, I've just been gathering that after I met Dr. Anderson. He was the orchestrator of Treemonisha, and I met him, through this email and stuff like that, and he's been telling me about what happened and stuff there. And the other Colin Johnson stuff is in the book. And also, like I said, I teach that. Yeah.
Cool. More questions? There's one in the chat, but I just wonder if Stan wants to say it out loud.
Come on, Stan, do it.
Yeah, I'll ask it out loud. I was making sure my mic is good. Yeah, so my question was, first of all, thank you, everyone. This has been a great conversation. The music department at Yale Music School is having a discussion about Porgy and Bess tomorrow, so I was like, oh, geez, let me get ready for that. What's that about to be about? Mostly looking at how a bunch of jazz musicians played it afterwards, therefore, I guess, honoring and nullifying any sort of, space that needs to be examined about and around and within the piece. So I was happy to have this conversation. I feel like this is a nuanced and, should I decide to go into this next conversation tomorrow, I feel like at least I've gotten this perspective. So my question was about Little Shop of Horrors. I watched Little Shop of Horrors recently, just tried to re-watch it. Growing up in the Pacific Northwest, Portland, Oregon, people did South Pacific at my public high school, and middle school, we did Little Shop of Horrors, and I played in the pit orchestra for it. I'm a sound designer right now, first year at Yale School of Drama, but I was playing saxophone in the pit orchestra, and I was like, oh, this is great, cool show. And then I rewatched it now, and it felt to me sort of extremely racialized upon contemporary viewing, where it felt a little bit like Porgy and Bess, where Crown is instead a plant and there's a supernatural element, and Catfish Row becomes Skid Row, there's still a sort of gospel replaced with more sort of like doo-wop and R&B. But my question was about what point in the reimagining of a story is it a sort of reimagining to become a commentary on the original story and a reframing of the original story, and when it's just an extension of that sort of original sin, for lack of a better word, of the piece that is sort of steeped in the cultural context of, you know, those time periods that it was based in. Yeah, that's my question.
That's a great question. I think that I'm speaking in draft as Nicole Brewer encourages us to do at Yale. So I apologize if what I have to say is not fully formed. But as you mentioned, Little Shop of Horrors, one of the first things that I thought of was the plant and the bright red lips that are usually put on the puppet. I think you're absolutely right about the supernatural elements of the story, especially as it relates to the plant, but then also the street urchins as well. But one of the things that I do appreciate about the musical is that the Black characters do not die, and that they are actually triumphant. And so that is one of the things that I enjoy, because so often Black characters die on stage in musicals by white people as a way to teach white audience members emotional life lessons about race. And so it's just nice to experience a musical or a play where that does not happen. I also think that your comment about Porgy and Bess is fascinating. I mean, I love Porgy and Bess. God knows I do, but it does bother me that the folk opera has become a synecdoche for Black musical theater, as if there were not Black artists working and innovating the Black folk opera at the same time that Gershwin was. And so not just a Hughes and a Hurston, but also a Theodore Brown, and also an Asadata Defora as well. So I would like the School of Music to put Porgy and Bess to bed and really investigate these other works that they usually do not take up in their curriculum. But I think it might be interesting for them to talk about the most recent Broadway revival of the show, which many scholars considered a Black feminist reimagining of the opera, because Deidre Murray made some changes to the score, and also to the arrangements. Susan Laurie Parks made changes to the book, and Diane Paulus worked closely with Audra McDonald to really make the character much more three-dimensional than it usually is when it's done in opera houses. So that might be an interesting entree into the discussion tomorrow, to think about the work that Black artists in the past have done to negotiate their discomfort with the work at the same time that they bring a humanity to the characters that may not be present in the book and school already. And so essentially, I think that we should move Gershwin and Hayward to the margins and really center the experiences of the Black artists in the show, especially someone like Eva Jesse, as Paula mentioned earlier, who people never talk about when they talk about Porgy and Bess, even though her labor and her work is instrumental to the piece, even as it is uncredited.
Thank you, thank you, thank you all for being here with us. Thank you, Stan, for that. So, that's the question to really wrap this moment. I want to be in that class with you tomorrow. So appreciate the Salon Committee for curating these conversations and bringing them forward. And thank you for the invitation. Eric, also at your invitation, I am here and I appreciate that. I appreciate being able to spend this time with Paula and Sean and Eric and just begin to learn something new and really astounding and wonderful. Thank you all for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for moderating as well.
And thank you all.
I had thank yous and I forgot to say them earlier today. I wanted to thank Eric for inviting me and Wingspace and Sean and Tamilla. This has been very exciting for me. I don't get to do this at all, so this was lovely. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, you should do it more.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thank you. And I have to tell you, Tamilla, I was so thrilled to see that you were the assistant director of Hadestown. That's wonderful. Yeah.
It's a pleasure to be with that company for sure. Good night, friends.
Have a good night, everybody.
Turn it off. Thank you all for being here.